For the rest of the book of Genesis, we're going to zoom in on the family of Abraham and consider the covenant that God has made with him. So that begins in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Let's hear the covenant of the Lord to Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred to your father and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So there's three major concepts that we hear here. Blessing and curses, as well as the concept of covenant. So let's understand those words. Blessing. That is to visualize and verbalize a positive future for someone. And as you read through the family of Abraham, you hear how desperate the kids are for the father's blessing. And then cursing. That's visualizing and verbalizing a negative future for somebody. Sometimes we hear the word cursing and we think it's profanity or something like that. But no, it's speaking ill of someone, that future for them. It can also be living incongruent with who his character is, and that's what taking the name of the Lord in vain is. But covenant, that's the big idea. And covenant means to cut. That's what it comes from. The Bible Project videos really unpacked the concept of covenant really well. But we're just going to tease a few more ideas out. So you've probably signed a contract before. It's not quite like a covenant, but it'll begin our understanding. You signed a contract maybe for a lease on an apartment to rent, something like that. So you're obligated, but you can always get out of a contract. So a covenant's not like that. It's more than a contract. So maybe you understand the concept of an oath. So who are people that take oaths? Well, law enforcement, military, our president. Raise their right hand and repeat after me. I do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. For example, that is an oath that somebody takes. And oaths are always confirmed. The last phrase of those oaths are, "So help me God." So the oath taker is calling down on themselves divine judgment if they do not follow through with the terms of the oath, if you don't hold it up. And another thing that some might even consider to be parallel with oath or even beyond it is a vow. You vow something. And probably the most common place we see vows are at weddings. That's where we take vows. So let's think all the way back then to biblical times now, after considering some modern illustrations. Tribal chiefs would sit down to make a covenant. And when they did that, there was often a covenant ceremony that sometimes looked like this, where they would take animals and cut them in half and lay them, basically creating a pathway of blood, a river of blood in between the animals. And then they would walk together through this aisle to signify, basically saying, if I don't hold up my end of this covenant, then may what has happened to these animals happen to me. That's pretty serious. And so now back to that last modern day analogy of a wedding. That tribal ceremony is actually somewhat pictured in a traditional Western wedding ceremony. You have two sides, the two families, and an aisle that is walked down the middle, where then vows are then taken, oaths are made in public in front of everybody. Another thing back then, eating together was often a way to then kind of confirm that this promise has been made. It's a way of saying, we're cool with each other, we're good. And you see that in a traditional wedding as well. The reception that follows the wedding ceremony, a covenant meal. So let's consider, when else do we see meals that are confirming of covenants, so to speak, in the Bible? When else do you see it? Well, let's just simply go to the life of Jesus for a few examples. Real easy one to think of is he calls Zacchaeus to come down out of the tree, and he says, I'm coming to your house. And he eats there with him. Jesus is accused of eating with tax collectors and sinners. What is this signifying of who Jesus is and his intention to make covenant and be faithful to those who are even far from him? But probably the biggest one that truly reeks of actual covenant is the Last Supper, where Jesus eats a meal with his disciples and recrafts the story of the Passover, the original Passover we'll read about in Exodus. He recrafts that in that Last Supper with his disciples, where they eat the bread, drink the wine, and he actually doesn't complete the ceremony. He says, I won't eat of this or drink of the fruit of the vine until I've come in my glory, until the covenant is fulfilled. So wow, here's a meal that was confirming a covenant that he was making and fulfilling within the next day. You might have also heard a term in more modern day time, sacrament. Depending on if you grew up in church, some churches use the word sacrament. Sacrament comes from the Latin word for oath. So, what is a sacrament? Well, a sacrament is a physical representation or extension of God's grace to us. So, what are some sacraments that the church calls some sacraments? Well, they call a wedding a sacrament, sacrament of marriage. The vows of the priesthood is a sacrament, and the Eucharist or Lord's Supper is a sacrament, and that's pretty obvious from what we've already unpacked here. But other things that some churches will call sacrament is confession, because that is the physical extension or representation of God's grace to us. That as we confess our sins to God to be forgiven and to others to be healed, James 5:16 speaks of that, then we are receiving God's grace, and we are remembering in all these things, the wedding, the priesthood, the Lord's Supper, confession, and others, we are remembering God's covenant that he made with us. So there is, back to the word covenant, comes from the word that means to cut. And there is something of us that is cut every time we make a covenant. It's going to cost us something. I mean, consider the examples we've already given from modern day. That oath costs the military members something. That vow of marriage costs the husband or wife something, that we lay down our lives for the other. And that we, and in that relationship with Jesus and God, that we would lay down our pride and our preferences. That's what being a part of that covenant actually costs us as well. But covenant brings freedom, is what I really want you to understand. It may cost us something, but it brings such freedom. Let me speak of marriage, for example. I've been married at this point for about 5.5 years to Josh, and I'm getting older. You can see that here. But in this covenant, he has promised to remain faithful to me. So no matter how old I get, how much my body may fall apart or fail me, he will remain faithful to me. So that covenant brings freedom to be who I am. Likewise, both of us are human. We're going to make mistakes. He has failed at times, right? He is human. He's finite. He has not met every single need of mine when I've wanted it. And my covenant to him is that I will remain faithful, and I won't bail on him in the middle of his finiteness. And God said that too. He said that even when we are faithless, he remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. Covenant is what God does because covenant is who God is. So let's we started at contract. And so I want to explain that the difference between contract and covenant. Contract is an exchange of goods and property. This is mine, that is yours. But covenant is an exchange of persons. I am yours and you are mine. Do you hear the marriage language in there? But also hear what God says to his people. I will be your God and you will be my people. That's covenant language, not contract language. You can get out of a contract, but you cannot get out of a covenant. So when you think covenant, think father, not judge. Think family room, not courtroom. And this is why the covenant with Abraham's family was so important. And we're going to take a look, zoom in at Genesis chapter 15 and unpack this making of this covenant with Abraham. So go ahead and turn there with me to Genesis chapter 15. We see in verse number 1 where God initially makes the covenant with Abram. He says, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield and your very great reward." There in verse 1. So who God is, that's what God says who he is. I'm your shield and your great reward. But who we think God is how we will deal with the circumstances in our lives. Because Abram then turns in later in verse 8 and says, how can I know this? How can I know this? But let's go back to verse 5 and 6. God brings Abram outside and says, look towards the heaven, number the stars, if you're able to. And he says to him, so shall your offspring be. But then Abram believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So can God be trusted? And then later on, that's what Abram is asking. And then later on, Abram is called the father of faith. It was credited to him as righteousness. Verse 7, God says basically, this is who I am and what I've done for you. And Abram asks in verse 8, how can I trust you? Then in verse 9 through 11, God says, hey, bring some animals to me. And if you read verses 9 through 11, does this sound familiar? Cutting animals in half. This sounds like that ceremony. And in verses 13 through 16, God reiterates the covenant and the promise and says, this is how it's going to go down. But verse 17, this is what I want you to see. This pot passes through the river of blood. But Abram is still asleep. This is a vision. The pot goes through alone. Abram doesn't. Do you see that God is making a covenant with Abram, but not requiring Abram to walk through it as well? God's basically saying, if I don't keep this up, or if you don't keep this up, the ends of the covenant, then may what has happened to these animals happen to me. And do you see that that was fulfilled in Jesus? We didn't keep our end of the bargain, but God did and took it on the cross as a fulfillment of this covenant. And that's what God is saying in this covenant ceremony. So how does this fit into the whole story? Wow. Well, this covenant was repeated down a family line. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And this is your family and my family as we are Christians grafted into the line. And so that family's a tad dysfunctional. And let's be real, so is ours. So are we. But this is our story. God plans to rescue the world through Abraham's family, to bless them so they could be a blessing. And his plan is to rescue this world through us, to bless us so that we can be a blessing as well. But looking at Abraham's family specifically, we see Abraham that he is believing what is not there yet and what he may never see. And so can we believe what we don't see as well? Abraham's son Isaac, his name means laughter. And God fulfills a promise even when there seems like there's no way in the birth of Isaac. So can we trust God and that he would make a way even when there seems no way? And can we approach our days not with only sorrow, but also laughing at the days to come, as it says in Proverbs chapter 31. And then Jacob. God calls himself the God of Jacob, even. Throughout the Bible, God calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and sometimes just Jacob. But wasn't Jacob's name changed to Israel? Well, he also calls himself the God of Israel. But it just amazes me that God calls himself specifically, and sometimes just simply, the God of Jacob. What did his name mean? Deceiver? He was a liar and a swindler. He did things that were so obviously outside the will of God. But yet God called himself the God of Jacob. It's almost like God is saying, try me. I'm that guy's God. So if he can be the God of Jacob, certainly can he not be the God of Marla? And then how about Joseph? Joseph, how about when you are like Joseph, feeling stuck, feeling imprisoned, feeling forgotten about, feeling lied about, and being impatient? Can he be your God as well? Keep his promise and his covenant to you like he did to Joseph? And then all those dudes' wives. Oh my goodness. How about when you feel barren or used or not protected or thrown out there? Yeah, he's those ladies' God too. And he kept his covenant faithfulness to them as well. And he will to you. He uses us like he used them to show other nations what he is like. And Jesus does as well. That Jesus shows us what God is like, because we are all intended to be image bearers, as Jesus was, and covenant partners. Because covenant renews partnership. And he has made a covenant with us to renew partnership with us, to be those image bearers of his. We already read about that with Noah here in this section. And in this episode, we also read about Abraham, that in return, he's asking Abraham to trust and train up his family to do right and justice. We will read about the covenant with the whole tribe in the book of the law, as well as the covenant with David, that these things would lead Israel to do right and do justice. Later on in the one story, that's what all the prophets are talking about. Hey, you aren't doing right and you aren't doing justice. You once were slaves, now you're free. Why are you enslaving other people? That's the story of the prophets later on. And God says he is faithful, even when they fail. Abram gives away his wife. Sarah gets him to sleep with Hagar because she wants kids. Jacob deceives. We see that his people fail repeatedly, and so do we. But he is faithful, even when we fail. And he desires to keep using us, not just in spite of ourselves, but sometimes even because of our failings. And despite those odds, we can simply trust God, trust his promise, and say with Jacob, the closing lines of Genesis, what you meant for evil, God used for good and for the saving of many people. And that is what the new covenant and its fulfillment is. The evil of taking the life of Jesus and his whole life, God used it for good and for the saving of many people. He was the faithful partner that we were meant to be but could not be. So, who is God? And what does this mean for us? He is the covenant-keeping God whose nature is to bless you so that you can be a blessing to the world around you, showing them what he is like.